Hello YouTube, Dave here again. Today we are finally returning to the Age of Worms adventure path as we look at Death and Doppelgangers. Specifically, we are looking at issue number 127 from October of 2005, and the adventure is the Hall of Harsh Reflections. This adventure is designed for a group of 7th level characters, and it should pick up directly where the previous event, the assault on Blackwall Keep, basically where that left off. At the end of that, the player characters have sort of discovered a bit of some collusion between a group known as the Ebon Triad and these green Caius worms that have been infecting some undead in the area, as well as having a black dragon that was guarding an egg that ended up being filled with these green Caius worms in an attempt to destroy an entire tribe of lizard folk. That, along with information that the players learned from their direct confrontations with the Ebon Triad, as well as the green Caius worm that they found preserved in the Necromancer Filge's lair at the end of the Whispering Cairn. The players are summoned by their mentor, the smartest man in Diamond Lake, Aliston, and given the information, the evidence, and is sent to the Free City. The Free City is undefined in this particular scenario, but essentially it is Greyhawk. As the campaign progresses, the setting actually stops being generic and actually really becomes very centered in like the world of Greyhawk. But at this point, the Free City could be Greyhawk, it could be Waterdeep, it could even be the city of Sharn if you were running Waterdeep. Along the way, the player characters may encounter a few enemies, some bandits, some wild animals, or just some other travelers. The journey takes them about 5 to 6 days. It's something where, you know, you want to do a couple of things, but I honestly didn't. I think I ran one encounter that was combat related, and then I had another like role-playing encounter where they, came across some traveling merchants on their way to the Free City. When the players reach the Free City, before they can get their meeting with the sage Elagos, Aliston's close friend, the players find that they are arriving as the Free City is involved in some celebrations in advance of their Champions Games. Basically, which is like a gladiatorial event, non-lethal, but a gladiatorial, tournament for the masses and for the amusement of all in the city. But it's a pretty big event, and before it, there's this parade going through the city streets. During the time that the players are moving through these streets and around this parade route, they may potentially be pickpocketed by a pair of rogues, and they also have to contend with a chimera who was caged and part of a parade float, but manages to break free and start, assaulting the onlookers. Also on their way to Elagos, they meet a street prophet who foreshadows quite a few things involving the worm that walks, the crawling chaos, the Champions Games, the corruption in the Free City. Stuff that isn't necessarily going to be totally apparent at this point in time, but it does foreshadow some stuff nicely that will take place later on in the campaign. In fact, it will take place in the next installment. Upon meeting Elagos, he informs the party that while he is somewhat knowledgeable in the things that Aliston has sent to him, he's by no means an expert and can definitely give them some information, but it's going to take a few days of research. So while that's going on, they are free to simply take in the sights or just relax at one of the local nearby inns. During this time as well, if you went through the Mistmarsh scenario with the lizard folk, and you were able to actually persuade them to come up with a diplomatic solution to their raids against the different keeps there. At the Free City, the players can actually contact a government official and try to set up for those negotiations. So it's nice to have that there if the player characters did reach that sort of solution. If not, it's not a big deal, but it is cool that it was included here as something that they could do. Once they leave Elagos's home, and before we sort of get into the rest of the adventure, the player characters are sort of made out by a group of doppelgangers and their shadowy masters that have identified the players and the information that they brought with them and the person that they are seeking out as potential threats. So a plan is hatched to try to discredit the player characters and eventually lure them to the doppelganger's lair, where they can sort of take them out and get rid of them. But what they do is actually kind of neat, because they wait for one of the evenings when the player characters are just resting at the bar, at the tavern, the inn that they're staying at. If one of the players leaves early or sort of separates himself from the rest of the group, one of the doppelgangers impersonates that player character and then walks up and just blatantly out in the open stabs the innkeeper right in the chest, trying to make it look like the player characters are, you know, these murderers. The innkeeper isn't necessarily dead, but he is bleeding out and dying. Then the doppelganger flees until he's out of line of sight, changes form again to appear as just like a traveling merchant that was staying at the inn, and then tries to stir up the crowd to go after the player characters. It's a tense situation, but the players can diffuse it by engaging in diplomacy, by healing the innkeeper, you know, things along those lines. But it was a pretty cool little sequence. It's also during this moment where something a little more devious can take place. So as we see here, one of the sections is called The Body Thief. Now this is a section, there's a ton of information given here, but the basic gist of it is, at this point, if a player separates from the rest of the group, you could have that player captured by the doppelgangers and replaced by one of them as a sort of like insider, this mole working with the player characters. And this individual's main goal is to get the players to go investigate where the doppelgangers are and lure them into an ambush where they can be killed. This is sort of a touchy thing, and it does recommend that, you know, you make sure that the players are okay with this type of event happening, because it will turn into a brief moment of player versus player as the person who's been taken over reveals himself and their treachery later on in the adventure and actually fights the players directly. If you do choose to have this take place, which is totally optional, it's not required by any stretch, but if you do have this take place, the player who was captured, they still earn their full share of experience from any combats that took place from the time that they were replaced to the time that the doppelganger who replaced them is defeated in combat. So they still get the regular experience. They're not punished for missing, like they don't fall behind the rest of the players. So it's sort of, it's an interesting way of doing it, but you want to really, you don't want to give it away, but you know your own group. If you're running a game, you know what your group is okay with or what they, you know, might necessarily not respond well to. But if you think they would, you know, take this in stride and have fun with it, this was actually a really cool section. I'll talk a little bit more about my personal experience with this adventure sort of towards the end, but this was the main part of it here that was definitely interesting. And I definitely have plans for it. At this point, the doppelganger that replaces the players is a doppelganger rogue, and I do have some suggestions for what to do instead of using the rogue stat block at the end of this video, so we'll sort of get back to that. But whether or not the player is replaced or not, eventually the player characters find their way to the Sodden Hold, which is the lair of the doppelgangers, making their way through until they reach the Hall of Mirrors, the Mirror Maze. So it's basically, it's a maze set up on the map, and let's just see if I can find the map here really quick. Right, so we've got the maze down here, and essentially there's just some like pressure plates that the characters can step on. That will essentially cause like sections of mirror wall to sort of shoot out of the floor to cut players off. It's definitely an interesting little section that you can run, separate the players a little bit, and there's a group of doppelgangers inside the maze that know their way around it perfectly, that as the players are separated from one another can sort of like pounce and try to take them out. There's also the arenas, basically like the big giant like spider things that are gross and I hate them. But they're also inside of the not necessarily the maze, but they're inside of the warehouse that the characters start making their way through. But it is a really cool section. Eventually they confront Telekin. He is the doppelganger leader of the group that's been harassing the player characters. And he is actually a greater doppelganger. One interesting fact about him, though, is when he assumes his true form, the players discover that he has this green brand on his forehead. So they kind of show artwork here of him in human form, but in his true form, he's got this green marking on his forehead. Now, when the players defeat Telekin, they haven't actually finished the adventure yet. You may think that that was sort of the end of the adventure. However, shortly after they defeat him, a mind flare and a couple of drow end up teleporting in to investigate what's going on. The mind flare blasts the players with his mind blast ability, while the drow thralls sort of attack the players. The mind flare does stay out of this particular combat and will teleport away if the players get too close to him. He wasn't really spoiling for a fight at this point. He just knew that Telekin had suddenly, disappeared, had died. He had some sort of connection to him, like telekinetic connection. And once that stops, he goes to investigate. The players can also notice, if they're paying close attention to this mind flare, that he also bears a green mark on his forehead, similar to the one that Telekin had. With the drow thralls defeated and the mind flare disappearing, the players do track down this particular mind flare into his underground lair, where they contend with some other drow, and then finally get the chance to confront the mind flare himself. One really cool room in this particular section, though, has to be the museum. So the museum has just a whole bunch of oddities, including a statue of a Vrock demon. But the Vrock demon is actually technically a trap and an encounter all in one, because he will actually turn, he starts off as stone, but if the players disrupt or try to take anything, touch anything in this room, try to remove anything from this room, then the Vrock springs to life and will attack the players. But if they investigate, if a rogue checks out and really looks around, especially at the demon itself, they can technically disarm the mechanism that turns the demon back into flesh. So it was kind of a neat. I love rocks, and it was just a really cool encounter. Then the players encounter the mind flare, who is Zerzog, and this guy is, again, I love mind flares, but he's a mind flare sorcerer, challenge rating 11. He is definitely no joke, and he can also be a lot more brutal. Knowing that the player characters are coming, he does have several spells that he can cast on himself pre-combat, and if he manages to cast all of the different spells on him that he prepared as buff spells, then it can be a pretty tough fight. Again, he opens up with his Mind Blast, and this particular Illithid will actually fight to the death, because in one of the adjoining rooms where he keeps some of his ledgers and information, there is also a pool filled with mind flare tadpoles, so his way of spawning more of his kin. The tadpoles are really not that important to the overall adventure. However, as the players, after they defeat the mind flare and go through his possessions, they do find that the mind flare had several business ledgers posing as, the doppelgangers would pose as merchants and would sell off what we would generously consider to be black market goods, contraband, or things that could be, very valuable relics. But one of the important things to note is an item by the name of the Apostolic Scrolls has been sold to a man by the name of Loris Rachnan, who is the owner and operator of the Free City Arena that is preparing for their Champions Games. So whatever the significance of this Apostolic Scroll is, why the owner of a gladiatorial arena would want it, why he would buy it off of, mind flayers and doppelgangers, is definitely very much an unknown. But it's sort of a cliffhanger that is designed to set up the events that will take place in the next installment as the players have to infiltrate the Champions Games themselves. But that was the adventure, the Hall of Harsh Reflections. And this was a pretty cool chapter to run. It's a lot of, I'm not going to say it's a lot of filler, because the events with Zarzog, the Mind Flayer, and his doppelganger associates, it does serve to advance the story a little bit. It foreshadows something that could potentially be very, very wrong, or potentially scary about the Champions games coming up. It's definitely a cool section. As far as like the actual like progression of the story overall is concerned, though, the only thing that really helps push the story forward in this installment is the Apostolic Scroll, the information that had been sold to the owner of the arena, because you have like the information that was given to Elagos, who plays a larger role in the installments going forward, but at this point he's still kind of researching things while this is going on. But that said, even though this is kind of a filler section, minus the very end there, which does help progress things, this was still a really cool section to run. My favorite part, besides the Mind Flayer, because again I'm a sucker for Mind Flayers, but my favorite part of this absolutely had to be the fact that one of the player characters could be replaced by a doppelganger, and sort of running that section. So that's actually something that I ended up doing in my campaign. Now, I have to admit, I was kind of a you-know-what disturber when it came to this, because I knew one of my players had sort of a contentious relationship with one of the other players in the group, and so I kind of like knew ahead of time that he would be the best choice to take on the role of the Mind Flayer, and it might even give a little bit of catharsis to the other player who had been sort of, again, not like in a way that was distracting from the game, or in a way that was something that was actually like building ill will between the players. It was just sort of like a witty, like back and forth kind of thing, where they were always sort of just constantly at each other, but not in like a harsh way or anything. But it may have been a little bit cathartic to let that player fight and, kill this individual who had been annoying him for the last several adventures, only to see him revert back to like the doppelganger form, and then, go from there. But I did have the player replaced by the doppelgangers. Now, the thing that you kind of have to do with this is, if you are going to run it, it's one of those things where you kind of need to set it up between games in order for it to actually sort of be effective, because everybody knows that if you're in the middle of a game and the dungeon master asks you to go into a different room with them, that something is up, right? And as much as the players may not try to metagame, there's always going to be a little bit of metagaming there. So it just so happened that the way that the sessions lined up is the players ended up getting to the city and going through some of the encounters with like the Chimera, the role-playing stuff, and they also went through the encounter with the where the Mind Flayer impersonated one of the player characters and then tried to murder the innkeeper. But that's sort of where my session ended for that week, and that's when I sort of decided to approach this player and just say, hey, would you be interested in doing this? He was totally for it. Now, when you are running this section of it, I do believe it does mention that you should allow the player to use their regular character sheet and their normal hit points and abilities that they could do, even though the Mind Flayer himself wouldn't be able to do it, just as a way of sort of preventing suspicion. Like if suddenly, because the player that was replaced in my group was actually a wizard, so to have a rogue replace the wizard and suddenly not be able to cast spells was definitely going to be like a massive red flag. They kind of, I think they recommend that you basically just let the players use their regular stats until the the doppelganger is discovered, and then you can revert to it using like the stats from the adventure itself. That's okay, I guess, but there is a solution that came out in a book that was released sometime after this installment of the of Dungeon Magazine. If you have the Races of Destiny book for 3rd edition 3.5, it covers like humans, I think it's doppelgangers, and some other races, including like the Illumins, which are like this brand new race. Well, I'll probably talk about that book in a future video, but there is a prestige class, and I'm not huge on 3rd edition prestige classes, but this was one prestige class that I actually really, really liked. It was available for humans, changelings, and doppelgangers. Changelings are like half human, half doppelganger, and then doppelgangers are obviously, they're doppelgangers. But it was a prestige class called the Chameleon. And what it would do is, as you progress in levels through this class, it would allow you to mimic the class features of like other classes. So you could pretend as a chameleon to be a wizard, and you would have access to a handful of spell slots that you could use. You'd have a spell book that you could prepare from. You could pretend to be like a cleric and, you know, pray for your spells, or you could pretend to be a fighter, or like you could just basically take on some aspects of the different core rulebook classes. And it was a really cool concept. Like I said, it was one of the few prestige classes that I really did like. And I did end up running, because I ran this campaign at the point in time in which 4th edition was basically already out. So I was running this in like 2010, like 2011, I think is when I was running this. It wrapped up in 2012. I do remember that part. So in a previous campaign, I actually designed an NPC who was a doppelganger who had taken over the identity of an NPC trusted by the player characters, and he had the chameleon class. And I tried to foreshadow it a little bit by, like, he would shift his focus, you know, because you could change what your focus was. When you get to high enough levels, you could sort of actually change on the spot, or, you know, a certain number of times per day. But he would actually have, like, at one point he could disarm traps like a rogue, he could cast like cure spells like a cleric, throw out magic missile like a wizard. But it was just a really, really cool class. And if I were to run this again for 3rd edition, I would definitely make the doppelganger who replaces the player, I would give him the chameleon prestige class. And by doing so, I would just have the one stat block that the player would use. And they would just use the chameleon abilities to mimic whatever class that they had. And then, you know, when the jig is up, then he could just revert to his like normal abilities or whatnot. But that's what I would recommend. So if you are running this today, and you have access to the Races of Destiny book for 3rd edition, then I would recommend retooling the Doppelganger Rogue and turning him into like a Doppelganger, maybe Rogue / Chameleon, so that you could have him mimic the other player characters or the classes that he would replace, without just basically kind of cheating it and let the player do things that the doppelganger has no access to, and then have it be kind of jarring when he transforms back into himself after being discovered and can no longer do the things that he was able to do just a few minutes ago. So that's what I would recommend. But other than that, there's really not much to this one. It's pretty simple, pretty straightforward, but, you know, it was a lot of fun to go through. But definitely the moment where the player betrayed the group, and, you know, the person that he was kind of, you know, needling and antagonizing a bit, you know, finally felt relief at, you know, being able to take him out, only to be a little bit disappointed, I guess, when he reverted back to a doppelganger. It was just a really cool time. I also remember, like, when they came across the captured party member, it was kind of funny because there was debate as to whether that was the actual character or not, or if it was just another doppelganger. And they even, you know, jokingly, you know, toyed with the idea of just leaving him there, but they didn't. It was like I said, it was all in good fun. But you do need to know your group. If you have a group of players where something like that may cause them to, like, not trust one another going forward, or might be problematic, then, you know, definitely just skip that plot device. It's optional. It's not something that you need to do, but it was a lot of fun, and it can be a lot of fun with the right people. It was just a great section. The travel sequence, you know, you're supposed to roll for encounters like twice a day kind of thing. But if you're doing this twice a day for like 5-6 days, you know, it can get a little tedious. So my recommendation would be to pick like a single combat encounter during the overland travels, and then, you know, maybe like a role-playing one or 1 or 2 role-playing ones, but try to keep that section relatively, you know, simple. The parade section was a lot of fun. If the players don't present an easy opportunity for someone to do like a, you know, a bump and grab sort of thing with pickpocketing. Don't force it, but you know, you still have like the encounter with the Chimera. If the rogues don't get involved, if like the street thieves don't get involved, it's fine. Like, don't force it. And the encounter with the Mind Flayer again was a lot of fun. It was one of my favorite monsters, so I really enjoyed running that section. You know, my group was you know, pretty good at overcoming challenges, so I made sure when I was running it that the Mind Flayer, the Illithid, had all of his preparatory spells pre-cast when the battle began, and just knock off a few rounds of duration based on the order that it presents them in the magazine. But, you know, it's something that you have to consider and have to think about. I would say, like I said, you know, it makes spellcasters a lot more, it makes the encounters with them a little bit more fun, a little bit quicker to go through, a little bit more memorable if they don't spend the first couple of rounds casting buff spells on themselves. So I did it ahead of time. It's something that is sort of worked into the adventure, so you can kind of figure that out yourself if you want. But, you know, just stick to the ones that they list. Don't go through and cherry pick, you know, spells. Just stick to the ones that they list in the tactics section. But yeah, a really cool adventure. Like I said, pretty simple and straightforward, not a lot to it. The biggest set piece here is the Doppelganger switch, which again, you know, run if you know the right group. But yeah, it was a lot of fun for me. That was the most memorable section. You know, everything else was kind of standard. But fun. Like I said, the encounter with the Mind Flayer was challenging, but it was, you know, the players overcame it. It was rewarding. The Street Preacher kind of prophesizing some of the events that can come to pass very shortly, and the Codicil of White the Codicil of, I'm thinking of the wrong thing. I was thinking of a 5th edition game I just ran earlier today. The Apostolic Scroll is what I meant to say. You know, that foreshadowing was just really, really cool. And I remember when I ran my next session, it sort of ended on that note, and the players were definitely intrigued to go forward and see what happens in the next installment. So there you go. Let me know in the comments below if you went through this adventure yourself, either as a player or DM back in the day. You know, did you replace one of the players, or were you or one of your player character allies replaced by a doppelganger? Did your group just sort of skip over that altogether? If you are planning on running this in the near future, are you going to try to do this doppelganger switch, or are you just going to omit that from it? And yeah, how did the fight with the Mind Flayer go? I guess that's kind of what I'd like to know. But yeah, thank you guys very much. I know it's been a while between these installments, and I really do apologize. Like I said, in 2022, I want to shift you know, not all of my focus, but more of my focus back towards videos that I just want to do for fun and enjoyment, instead of like your basic, you know, new product review and unboxings and stuff like that. So this is something that I've really wanted to come back to for a while. And yeah, like I said, it was just a simple, straightforward adventure, but a ton of fun. Definitely created some really fun memories. And yeah, I'd like to know what happened for any of you that ended up going through this or are planning on going through this, what your thoughts are, what your plans are for it. So yeah, thank you guys again very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you all next time. Take care.